I am 103 years old and I still cook my own breakfast every single morning. Not because someone helps me, not because I have a routine someone designed for me. Because I wake up hungry, I walk to my kitchen and I make it myself. My name is Eleanor, and the last pill I swallowed was 14 years ago when I was 89 years old. And I made a decision that every single doctor I had seen for the previous 2 decades would have argued against. I want to tell you something before I go any further. I am not special. I was not born with something the rest of you were not given. I grew up in the same era as my friends, ate the same foods, lived through the same hard years, buried the same kinds of losses. What happened to me was not luck, and it was not genetics, and it was not God deciding I deserved more years than Dorothy or Margaret or Helen. What happened to me was one quiet morning in my kitchen when I finally stopped doing what I had been told and started paying attention to what my own body had been trying to show me for years. But I need to go back before I can explain that morning, because you need to understand what I watched happen to the people I loved most before you can understand why I did what I did. Dorothy was my closest friend for 61 years. We met as young mothers, raised our children on the same street, buried our husbands within 3 years of each other, and somewhere in our late 70s, we started going to doctors together because neither of us wanted to go alone. The appointments had started to feel like a kind of assembly line. You sit down, you describe what is wrong, a prescription is written, you leave with a little paper, you fill it at the pharmacy, you come back in 3 months and describe what is still wrong, and another prescription is written, sometimes for the new thing that had appeared, sometimes for the side effect of the first thing. I watched Dorothy's nightstand go from bare wood to a cluster of orange bottles that took her 15 minutes every morning just to sort through. She was not getting better. She was getting managed, and there is a very large difference between those two things that I did not fully understand until much later. Margaret went into a facility when she was 84, not from a stroke, not from cancer, from exhaustion. Her daughter told me at the funeral 3 years later that the last thing Margaret said with real clarity was that she could not remember the last time she had slept through the night. Years of broken sleep, years of waking 2, 3, 4 times before sunrise, years of being handed one solution after another for a problem that nobody had ever actually diagnosed correctly. I stood at that graveside and I thought about my own nights, about my own orange bottles, about the fact that I too had not slept a full night in longer than I could clearly remember. Helen lasted the longest of the 3. She was stubborn in the way that women of our generation learn to be stubborn quietly and without making a fuss about it. But by 87, she had moved in with her son, and by 89, she was gone. And I remember sitting alone in my kitchen the week after her funeral, which was the week I turned 89 myself, looking at my own nightstand in my mind, counting the bottles, thinking about Dorothy and Margaret and Helen, and asking myself one question that I had never asked before. Not are these medications working? Not are these medications safe? But something much simpler and much more frightening. What if every single one of these is solving the wrong problem entirely? I had been waking up in the night for 11 years by that point, 2 times, 3 times, sometimes 4. I had been given things for my bladder, things for my prostate, which I do not have because someone had read the wrong chart, things for my sleep, things for the anxiety that had apparently developed as a result of not sleeping, things for the stomach upset caused by the anxiety medication. I was not being treated. I was being layered, and every new layer made the one beneath it harder to see. What I did next was not dramatic. I did not throw the bottles away in a moment of cinematic clarity. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and I thought carefully, and I made a quiet decision. I would stop for 30 days. I would tell my doctor, which I did, and she told me it was unwise, which I noted, and I did it anyway because I was 89 years old and I had just buried the last of my closest friends, and I decided I was old enough to be unwise on my own terms. The first thing I changed was dinner, not because I had read something or been told something, because I'd started paying attention, really paying attention in a way I had not bothered to do for years. And I had noticed something so simple it embarrassed me. Every night that I ate a heavy meal late in the evening, I woke more. Every night that I ate lightly and early, I slept longer. I had noticed this pattern distantly for years, the way you notice whether you are not planning to go out in. It did not feel like information. It felt like coincidence. But when I had nothing left to take and nowhere else to look, I turned toward that small, quiet observation, and I decided to take it seriously. I started eating one thing every morning without fail, not as medicine, not as a cure, as attention, as a commitment to listening to what my body was actually asking for, rather than handing it something to quiet the signal. Oats, plain slow-cooked oats with nothing added but a little warm water, and sometimes a spoonful of honey from a jar my neighbor brings me from her garden. I am not telling you oats are magic. I am telling you that oats were the first decision I made entirely for myself in 11 years. And that the act of making that decision, of saying I am going to pay attention to how this makes me feel and adjust accordingly, was the beginning of something I did not have a word for at the time. Within 6 weeks, I was sleeping 5 hours without waking. Within 4 months, I was sleeping through the night. I did not go back to my doctor to report this because I knew what would happen. She would find an explanation that had nothing to do with what I had done. That is not a criticism. That is simply how the system is organized. It is organized around intervention, not around the small, quiet choices a person makes alone in their kitchen before the rest of the world is awake. I am 103 now. I live in the same house I have lived in for 51 years. I drive myself to the market on Tuesdays. I cook every meal I eat. I sleep most nights without waking. I have not taken a prescription medication in 14 years, and I am not telling you to do what I did. Your body is your own, and your decisions are your own, and I am not a doctor, and I am not interested in being one. What I am is a woman who watched her 3 closest friends disappear into decline while following every instruction they were given, and who decided at 89 that the instructions might not have been written with her survival in mind. The thing I want to leave you with is not about oats. It is not about medication. It is about the difference between being managed and being understood. For 11 years, I was managed. Someone was always addressing the symptom. Someone was always handing me the next solution. And I was always accepting it because that is what you do. That is what we were all taught to do. That is the arrangement. You present the problem and you accept the answer, and you do not ask whether the person giving the answer has ever sat quietly enough to hear what the problem actually is. I had to do that sitting myself, alone at 89, in my kitchen, with a cup of tea and no one left to go to the appointments with me. If you are waking in the night, if you are tired in ways that sleep does not fix, if you have been handed solutions that circle the same problem without ever reaching its center, I want you to consider the possibility that your body is not broken, that it has been trying to tell you something specific in the only language it has, and that what it needs most is not another answer, but someone willing to listen carefully enough to hear the question. I learned that at 89. I hope you learn it sooner than I did.